My name is Alara Vance. I was 31 years old, a certified corporate auditor with 6 years of clean performance reviews and a reputation for finding what people tried to hide when I lost my job on a Wednesday afternoon in March. Not fired, laid off. There is a difference, even if it does not feel like one when the HR manager slides a severance folder across a glass table and tells you to return your badge by end of day. I drove home to my apartment, sat on my bathroom floor for about 40 minutes, and then called my parents because I did not know what else to do. My mother answered on the second ring, and before I could even finish explaining, she said, "Come home, sweetheart. We have a room. You can stay as long as you need." I believed her. That was the part I have spent the most time thinking about since. I packed 2 suitcases and a box of books. 3 weeks of searching for a new position had turned up nothing solid, just early round interviews and polite rejection emails written by people who never used my name. The savings I had were not nothing, but they were not comfortable either, not at the rate I would be burning through them if I paid rent somewhere while unemployed. Moving back home felt like the practical choice. It felt like the only choice. I loaded my car on a Sunday, drove 4 hours south, and told myself it was temporary. Most bad decisions feel temporary when you make them. My parents lived in a colonial-style house in a suburb that was trying hard to look more expensive than it was. The neighborhood had iron mailboxes and American flags and driveways that were pressure-washed every spring. My father, Julian, had built a small consulting business over the years, the kind that existed in that murky middle space between successful and struggling. My mother, Sylvia, had not worked outside the house in over a decade, which she described as a lifestyle choice, and which I had learned not to question out loud. From the outside, the house looked like the kind of place where everything was fine. That was always the point. I arrived around 7 in the evening. My father carried neither of my bags. He held the front door open and nodded at me the way someone nods at a delivery person, polite but not warm. My mother hugged me, but it was the kind of hug where her body stays slightly angled away, like she is protecting something from getting wrinkled. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and the faint ghost of a meal I had not been invited to. My old bedroom was upstairs, second door on the left, the same door I had pushed open every night for 18 years before I left for college. I told myself that familiarity was a kind of comfort. I was wrong about that too. The room had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way you would notice in a photograph, but in the specific, deliberate way that communicates something without saying it directly. The bookshelf I had built myself in 11th grade, the one with the slightly uneven third shelf that I had always meant to fix, was gone. The framed photo from my high school debate championship was gone. The quilt my grandmother had made me was gone. What remained was a neutral-colored bedspread, a small lamp, and a folded towel at the foot of the mattress like a mid-range hotel trying its best. I stood in the doorway for a moment before going inside. The room did not feel like mine anymore. It felt like I was a guest who had not yet been told what the checkout time was. I unpacked slowly, more out of something to do with my hands than any real sense of settling in. I arranged my books on the windowsill because the shelf was gone. I plugged in my laptop and set my work folders on the desk, mostly force of habit, the reflex of someone who has spent years organizing everything so she knows exactly where each piece is. By 10 o'clock, I was tired in that deep, behind-the-eyes way that is not really about sleep. I brushed my teeth, turned off the lamp, and lay on top of the unfamiliar bedspread in the dark. I remember thinking that tomorrow would feel better, that by morning, the strangeness of it would wear off. I found the envelope when I shifted my pillow to fluff it before lying down properly. It was a plain white business envelope, sealed, with my name written on the front in my father's handwriting. Not Mom, not a sticky note. My full name in ink, like correspondence. I sat up and turned on the lamp and held the envelope for a moment before I opened it. I had spent 6 years auditing other people's numbers, which means I had spent 6 years learning to notice when something feels off before you can explain why. Something felt off. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. The header read in a clean printed font, "Residential Occupancy Statement." Below that was a date, below that was my name, and below that was a number I had to read twice. $15,000. It was itemized. Room and board, dating back to my previous visit 2 Christmases ago. Utility contribution. Meals provided. What the document called a premium household management fee. And at the very bottom, a line that read emotional labor and family accommodation surcharge, followed by a dollar amount that had clearly been reverse engineered to make the total reach a round number. I sat there on the edge of the mattress reading it line by line the way I read every financial document, slowly, looking for the logic. There was no logic. There was only a number they had decided on and a list of reasons built backwards to justify it. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that because crying would have been easier, would have released something, would have let the feeling move. Instead, I just sat very still and read the page again. The formatting was neat. The font was consistent. There were no typos. Whoever had made this had taken time with it, had wanted it to look official, had wanted it to feel like something that came with authority and could not be argued with. That told me more than the charges did. Then I saw the detail that changed everything. At the very bottom of the page, below the signature line, in print so small it was almost not there, was a timestamp from a local print shop. The document had been printed 11 days earlier. 11 days before I moved my boxes into this house. 11 days before I had even called home to say I was struggling. I sat with that information the way you sit with something that has no good explanation. They had not reacted to me coming home. They had prepared. They had written the invoice, printed it at a shop to make it look formal, brought it back and put it in my room before I arrived, and then my mother had answered the phone and said, "Come home, sweetheart. We have a room." I did not sleep well. I lay in the dark and watched the ceiling and listened to the house settle around me, and I thought about the timestamp. I thought about how long 11 days was, long enough to reconsider, long enough to pick up the phone and say, actually, now is not a good time. Long enough to do anything other than what they had done, which was wait. Morning came with the smell of coffee and the sound of my father's news program playing at a volume slightly too loud for the size of the kitchen. I came downstairs in the same clothes I had slept in because getting fully dressed felt like too much effort before I understood what I was walking into. The table was set. That was the first thing I noticed, because the table in that house had rarely been formally set, not for a regular Tuesday morning. 3 places, a small pitcher of juice, everything arranged like a scene. My father was already seated. He was wearing a pressed button-down shirt, the kind he wore for client meetings, not for breakfast with his unemployed daughter. He glanced at his watch when I came in, the kind of glance that is meant to be noticed, and then looked back at his plate without greeting me. My mother stood at the counter pouring tea with the careful precision of someone performing a task they want to look graceful doing. Neither of them said good morning. I pulled out my chair and sat down because I did not know what else to do. The invoice was on my plate. A fresh copy, not the one from under my pillow, a new one, pressed flat, centered between the fork and the knife like it was the meal. My father waited until I had looked at it. Then he looked at his watch again and said, "Your first installment of $2,000 is due by Friday. If it is not paid, your car goes to the curb." He said it the way someone reads from a prepared statement, steady, no warmth, no room for interruption, like the decision had been made somewhere else and he was just delivering it. My mother lifted her teacup, took a slow sip, and then set it down on the saucer with a small, precise click. She said, "Love is an investment, darling. It is time for a dividend." She did not look at me when she said it. She looked at the window, at the backyard, at something outside that I could not see and probably would not have recognized even if I could. I remember thinking that line had been rehearsed. I remember thinking nobody says something like that off the top of their head at 8 in the morning. I looked at the invoice again. I looked at the emotional labor surcharge, the premium household management fee, the line items that existed only to fill space and reach the target number. I was an auditor. I had spent years looking at numbers that were designed to mislead, at figures arranged to tell a story that was not true, at documents built backwards from a conclusion. I recognized the structure immediately. This was not a bill. This was a performance, and the audience was me. I did not raise my voice. I had learned a long time ago that raising your voice in that house only gave people a reason to make the conversation about your reaction instead of their behavior. I placed my fork down on the edge of my plate, straightened the invoice with 2 fingers like I was organizing a file, and looked at my father directly. I asked him one question. I asked him if he kept a copy. He smiled at me, and it was not a kind smile. He said they had 3. I nodded. I stood up, picked up the invoice, and folded it once along the center crease. My mother finally looked at me then, and her expression was the one she used when she wanted to seem like she was being reasonable, that particular flatness that she wore when she wanted cruelty to sound like common sense. I did not give her anything to work with. I carried the invoice upstairs, closed my bedroom door behind me, and sat down on the edge of the unmade bed. I spread the document on my knee and read it again from the top, slowly, the way I would read any financial record that did not add up. $15,000. The number sat there on the page like a statement of fact when it was actually a statement of intent. They were not asking. They were informing me of a decision that had already been made. And the timestamp at the bottom was still there, small and damning and precise, telling me everything I needed to know about when this decision had actually been made and what my phone call home had actually set in motion. I opened my laptop and created a new folder. I labeled it with the date and the word documentation, because 6 years of auditing had made certain reflexes automatic. Whatever was happening in this house, I was not going to be the only one without a record of it. I made a copy of the invoice by photographing it on my phone from 4 different angles. I noted the timestamp. I wrote down in a plain document everything that had happened at breakfast, the words used, the order they were said in, the pressed shirt, the preset table, the way my father had checked his watch. Details matter. They always matter. I had built my entire career on the simple truth that details do not lie the way people do. The afternoon passed quietly, which was its own kind of loud. I heard my parents moving through the house below me, the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday, the television, the refrigerator opening, a phone call my father made in a low voice in his office with the door mostly closed. I stayed upstairs. I was not hiding. I was thinking. I was running through what I knew and what I did not yet know, and what the distance between those two things was likely to contain. $15,000 was a specific number. Specific numbers always mean something specific. I just did not know yet what it was. By evening I was hungry, but not hungry enough to go downstairs and sit at that table again. I ate crackers from my bag and drank water from the bathroom tap and sat by the window watching the neighborhood go dark, the porch lights coming on one by one down the block. The street looked peaceful. The kind of peaceful that does not know anything is wrong because it is on the other side of the wall from it. I thought about calling someone. I thought about my college roommate, about my former colleague from the auditing firm, about anyone who existed outside this house and its careful, performing quiet. I did not call anyone. Not yet. I did not have enough of the picture. A little past 9 o'clock, a soft sound came from the gap under my door. I looked over and saw something slide through the crack, the kind of small, quiet movement that is trying not to be heard. I crossed the room and picked it up. It was a protein bar, the kind with the foil wrapper and the bright label, the kind my younger sister Maya had always kept in every pocket and every bag since high school because she had always been in too much of a hurry to sit down for real meals. I turned it over in my hands, and something shifted inside the wrapper, not the bar itself. Something small and hard and flat pressed between the foil and the cardboard backing. I worked the edge of the wrapper open carefully, and a USB drive slid into my palm. Attached to it with a rubber band was a small square of paper torn from a notepad. The handwriting was Maya's. 6 words. That was all. Do not pay them. Look first. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed and the USB drive in my hand for a long time before I plugged it in. Not because I was scared, exactly, but because I understood, the way you understand something in your chest before your brain catches up, that whatever was on that drive was going to change the shape of things. Once I looked, I could not unlook. Once I knew, I could not unknow. I had spent my whole career chasing the truth inside other people's numbers, and I had learned that the truth does not care whether you are ready for it. It just sits there waiting, patient and still, until you are finally willing to open your eyes. I opened my laptop, plugged in the drive, and waited for it to load. The room was dark except for the screen. The house below me had gone quiet. A folder appeared on the desktop, unnamed, just a plain gray icon, the kind of file that does not announce itself because the person who put it there did not want it found by accident. I clicked it open. Inside were 3 subfolders: bank statements, investment records, and a document titled in plain text, Harrington Application Legacy Membership. I opened the bank statements first because that is where I always start. Numbers before narrative, data before story. The accounts were in both my parents' names, a joint checking account and 2 savings accounts I had not known existed. I scrolled through 3 months of transactions slowly, the way I would scroll through any client file, looking for the pattern underneath the surface. And it was there. It was absolutely there. Regular transfers, same day each month, same amount, moving from the checking account to a holding account I did not immediately recognize. I opened the investment records next. The portfolio was not small. It was not the portfolio of a couple who needed $15,000 badly enough to invoice their own daughter for it. There were index funds, a bond allocation, a modest brokerage account with positions going back 7 years. I sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. They were not broke. They were not struggling. The story they had told me, the unspoken implication underneath every word of that breakfast, the suggestion that this was about money they genuinely needed, that was not the story the numbers were telling. Then I opened the Harrington document, and the whole thing clicked into place the way a lock opens when you finally have the right key. The Harrington Country Club, Legacy Membership Tier. Application fee, initiation deposit, first-year dues. The total at the bottom of the application summary was $15,000, to the cent, the exact same number printed on the invoice my father had placed on my plate that morning. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, not because I did not understand it, but because understanding it required a moment of stillness before I could move forward. The $15,000 was not back rent. It was not a reimbursement for my upbringing. It was a buy-in fee for a private club, a club with iron gates and a waiting list, and the kind of name that people used to signal something about who they were and who they wanted to be around. My parents were not trying to recover a debt. They were trying to purchase a social identity, and they had decided that I was the most convenient way to fund it. I sat with that knowledge in the dark and felt something move through me that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but somewhere between the two. The specific feeling of realizing that you were not seen as a person in a situation, but as a resource in a plan. A soft knock came at the door, barely louder than breathing. I closed the laptop screen halfway and said, "Come in." And the door opened just wide enough for a body to slip through before it was pulled shut again behind her. My younger sister stood in the dark in an oversized sweatshirt and running shoes, like she had been somewhere and come back, or like she was always ready to leave at a moment's notice. Her face in the dim light from my cracked window looked older than I remembered it, tired in a way that 23 years old should not look tired. She sat down on the floor beside me without being asked, pulled her knees to her chest, and nodded at the laptop. She said she had been waiting to know if I had looked at it yet. I told her I had. She exhaled slowly, not quite a sigh, more like she had been holding something in for a while and had finally found a safe enough place to let a small piece of it out. I asked her how she had gotten those files. She said she had been building the folder for 2 months, pulling documents when they were left on the printer, photographing account pages when the browser was left open, writing down numbers she overheard during phone calls. She said she had been waiting for a reason to give it to someone who would know what to do with it. I asked her what was going on with her tuition. The question came out quieter than I intended. She did not answer right away. She looked at the gap under the door, checking, I think, to make sure no light had appeared in the hallway. Then she looked back at me and said she had not wanted to worry me. I told her I was asking now. She said the tuition payments had stopped coming at the beginning of the fall semester, 8 months ago. She had logged into her student account and found a balance due notice, and she had called the financial office, and they had told her the scheduled payment had not arrived. She had called home and asked about it, and my father had told her there was a cash flow issue at the business, and she should not panic and it would be handled. It was not handled. The second semester started, and the balance grew, and she received a formal warning from the university about her enrollment status. She did not tell me. She did not tell anyone. She picked up a second job at a coffee shop near campus and started tutoring 3 undergrads on weekends and catering private events on Saturdays when the bookings came through. She had been working 3 jobs and keeping her grades at a 3.8 and calling home every Sunday and telling our parents everything was fine. She had been protecting them even while they were taking from her. I listened to all of it without interrupting. That was the hardest part, staying quiet while she laid it out in that flat, controlled voice that people use when they have rehearsed something painful so many times that they have learned to say it without falling apart. Her hands were still in her lap. She was not crying. I noticed that she was not crying, and I understood it, because I had not cried at breakfast either, and we had learned that particular form of survival in the same house. I opened the laptop fully and turned it toward her and showed her what I had found. The investment accounts, the bond positions, the Harrington application. I watched her face as she read, and I watched the specific moment when the full shape of it landed, when she understood not just that the money existed, but that the money had always existed, that the tuition had not stopped because of a cash flow problem at the business, but because someone had made a deliberate choice to redirect it. Her jaw tightened. She looked away from the screen. She did not say anything for almost a full minute. Then she said, quietly, that she had given them the benefit of the doubt for 8 months. She had worked herself to the edge of exhaustion and told herself there had to be a reasonable explanation, because the alternative, the idea that the people who raised her had simply decided her education was less important than a membership application, was too heavy to carry without evidence. Now she had the evidence. And now it was heavier, not lighter, because there was nothing left to explain away. I took the laptop back and opened a blank document. Old habit, the auditor's reflex. When the picture becomes clear, you write it down before it shifts. I began typing out what I knew in plain, structured language. Liquid assets on hand. Monthly transfer amounts and destination account. Tuition payments redirected. Invoice amount. Harrington application total. I was not building a case for anyone else yet. I was building it for myself, because I needed to see it laid out cleanly before I could figure out what came next. The numbers told a story that was simple and ugly and entirely legible once you stopped wanting it to mean something else. 2 people who had enough had looked at their children and calculated what each one could contribute to a goal that had nothing to do with either of us. One of us had been quietly drained for 8 months. The other had been invited home and handed an invoice within 24 hours of arriving. The math was not complicated. The intent was not ambiguous. The only question was what to do with it. I looked at the drive in the side of my laptop and thought about the work that had gone into collecting what was on it. 2 months of careful, quiet documentation by someone who was already stretched thin, who had no margin left, who was doing it not because she was angry, but because some part of her had understood that eventually someone was going to need to know. She had not known it would be me. She had just kept the files and waited, the way you wait when you believe that truth eventually finds its way to the right pair of eyes. I asked her why she had waited 2 months before giving it to someone. She said she had not trusted that anyone would believe her without proof. I understood that answer all the way down. Growing up in that house, you learned early that your perception of events was negotiable, and that the person with the most confident voice in the room usually won the argument about what had actually happened. Documentation was not paranoia. Documentation was the only language that could not be revised after the fact. We sat together on the floor of that stripped room for a while without talking. The house was still. At some point, she leaned her head back against the side of the bed and closed her eyes, not sleeping, just resting, just letting herself exist in a space where she did not have to pretend anything for a few minutes. I watched her and felt something shift in my chest, something that was partly grief and partly something older and harder, a kind of love that knows it cannot fix the past, but is absolutely unwilling to let the future look the same. I told her I needed 48 more hours to understand the full picture before I did anything with what I had found. I told her I was not going to pay the $15,000. I told her I needed her to continue acting normal, to keep the household routine undisturbed for 2 days while I worked through the documents. She lifted her head and looked at me. She asked if I knew what I was doing. I told her I had spent 6 years finding the truth inside other people's money, and that this was the first time in my career I actually wanted to find it. She left the room the same way she had entered, quietly, barely a sound, the door pulling shut behind her with a click so soft it was almost not there. I stayed on the floor and opened the laptop fully and began working through the documents the way I would work through any audit file, methodically, page by page, transaction by transaction, following each number to where it came from and where it went. The investment accounts were clean on the surface, no irregularities in how they were structured, but the pattern of withdrawals over the past 8 months told a story that the account holder clearly had not expected anyone to read. By 2 in the morning, I had a clear picture. Not a partial picture, not a suspicion. A clear and documented picture of 2 people who had prioritized social ambition over their daughter's education, and manufactured a financial crisis to extract money from a second daughter who had just lost her job. The word fraud is a specific legal term, and I was careful with it in my own thinking. But the word manipulation required no such precision. What I was looking at was manipulation, organized, sustained, and deliberate. I saved the working document to the drive and closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a moment. I was not afraid. That surprised me a little, the absence of fear. I had expected to feel it by now, the cold water feeling of being up against something too large to manage. Instead, I felt something I recognized from work, the particular clarity that arrives when you have finally seen all the pieces and understand how they fit together. Clarity is not comfort, but it is something to stand on. I was still sitting at the desk the following afternoon, cross-referencing a third month of transactions against the application timeline, when I heard the front door open below me with more force than usual. Then footsteps in the hallway, quick and uneven, not the measured pace my father usually kept. I heard a voice, his voice, lower than usual, strained, coming up through the floor in pieces I could not fully assemble. I heard my mother's voice answering, calm at first, then not calm. I stayed where I was and listened to the shape of the sounds without the words. 20 minutes later, there was a knock at my door. Not soft, not polite, the kind of knock that has urgency behind it even when the person on the other side is trying to contain it. I opened the door. My father stood in the hallway still wearing his jacket, the pressed client meeting jacket, and his face had a particular look on it that I had not seen in years, the look of a man who has just been reminded that not everything responds to confidence and presentation. He said he needed to speak with me. He said a state tax examiner had contacted his business. There was going to be an audit. He looked at me with an expression I had to work hard not to name too quickly, and then he said 6 words that rearranged the entire week. He said, "I need your help, Alara." I stood at my bedroom door and looked at my father and said nothing for a long moment. That was something I had learned from years of sitting across from clients who were trying to manage how much they revealed. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is pressure. And the person who fills it first is usually the one who needs something. He filled it. He said the examiner had called his office directly, that there were questions about expense categorizations going back 3 fiscal years, that the audit was scheduled to begin in 9 days. He said he needed someone who understood how these processes worked, someone who could look at the books and help him get ahead of it. He said he thought I could help him. He did not say please. I asked him to give me until dinner. He looked like he wanted to say something else, something about urgency or timelines, but he stopped himself and nodded and went back downstairs. I closed the door and stood with my back against it and took a slow breath. I was not surprised. That was the thing, not even a little. I had been sitting with those financial records for 2 days by then, and I had seen the irregularities in his business, accounts the same way I had seen everything else, clearly, completely, in the specific language of numbers that do not lie even when the people attached to them do. I already knew what the auditors were going to find. The only question now was what I was going to do about it. I spent 2 hours at my desk going back through the business records that were included on the drive, the ones I had initially set aside while focusing on the household accounts. What I found there was not sophisticated. That was almost the saddest part of it. It was not elaborate financial engineering or complex scheme building. It was the kind of messy, incremental corner cutting that happens when someone has been telling themselves for years that the rules are slightly more flexible for them than they are for everyone else. Personal expenses run through the business. Client entertainment charges that did not match any actual client activity. Equipment purchases that appeared twice under different category headings. Small things, each one defensible in isolation, but together forming a pattern that any competent examiner would identify within the first afternoon of review. I could have fixed it. That is the honest truth, and I want to say it plainly because the easier version of this story leaves that part out. I had the skill. I knew the vocabulary, the reclassification strategies, the documentation language that makes a questionable entry look routine. I had seen it done by people far more experienced than my father, people who had built entire careers on the art of making the books say what they needed them to say without technically lying. I could have sat down with those files and made them cleaner, smoother, harder to question. I knew exactly how. And for about 4 minutes I actually considered it. Those 4 minutes were the most honest I had been with myself in a long time. I sat there and I let myself feel the pull of it, the old reflex of the child who wants to solve the problem in front of her because solving problems was the only currency that had ever bought her peace in that house. Fix it, and maybe things go back to some version of manageable. Fix it, and maybe the invoice disappears. Fix it, and maybe we all agree to pretend the last 3 days did not happen. I knew that pull. I had been answering it my entire life. And then I thought about my younger sister working 3 jobs in the dark, and the pull went quiet. I went downstairs at 6 o'clock. The dining table was set again, the same careful arrangement as Tuesday morning, the pitcher, the folded napkins, the chairs pulled out at equal distances like everything in this house was a presentation waiting for an audience. My father was already seated. My mother stood at the counter doing something that did not actually require her full attention, which meant she was listening. The room smelled like the pot roast my mother made when she wanted occasions to feel significant without admitting they were tense. I sat down and placed 2 documents on the table, face down, one in front of my father and one in front of my mother. Then I waited. My father looked at the papers and then looked at me, and in his eyes I could see the specific calculation of a man trying to determine whether what was happening was going in the direction he had planned. He reached for his document and turned it over. My mother did the same a moment later. The document was an invoice. I had formatted it carefully, cleanly, the same clean font my father had used on his residential occupancy statement, the same neat columns, the same professional header. But this one was mine. At the top it read Counterstatement of Outstanding Obligations, and it was addressed to both of them by name. I had spent the previous evening building it the way I would build any audit finding, with citations, with dates, with specific amounts and the documentation trail behind each one. The first section was for my younger sister's tuition. 2 full semesters. The exact dollar amounts that had been scheduled for payment and redirected instead. I included the dates the payments were due, the dates they were not made, and the current balance outstanding with the university. I did not inflate the number. I did not need to. The real number was already damaging enough. The second section was for 3 years of unpaid consulting work I had done for my father's business during my mid-20s, before I had taken the auditing position at the firm. I had reviewed contracts, organized tax filings, prepared financial summaries. I had done it because he had asked me, and because I had believed it was what families did for each other. I had never invoiced him. I had never expected payment. But if we were establishing the principle that family relationships were financial transactions with enforceable obligations, then I was fully prepared to apply that principle consistently and in both directions. The third section, the last line on the page, listed the compound interest on both amounts calculated at the rate my father had cited at the breakfast table 3 days earlier. 13% per month, his own stated rate. I had applied it exactly as he had described it, without modification, without mercy. My father read through the document without speaking. I watched his face move through several expressions, none of which he fully let land before moving to the next one. Surprise, then dismissal, then something that wanted to be anger but could not quite find its footing because he recognized the methodology. He recognized it because it was his. He had built the original invoice the same way, with the same logic, with the same architecture of itemization and authority. I had simply turned it around and aimed it back. My mother set her copy down on the table and folded her hands in front of her. She looked at me the way she looked at things that were inconvenient, with a kind of composed distance, like the problem might resolve itself if she waited long enough and kept her expression neutral. She said that this was not the time for games. I said I agreed completely. I told her I was not playing one. My father asked me, in a voice that was working hard to stay level, whether I was going to help him with the audit or not. And I said I already had. He looked at me. I told him that I had reviewed the business records thoroughly over the past 2 days, and that I had prepared a complete, accurate, and unaltered summary of the findings and submitted it to the state tax examiner's office that morning. I told him I had used my professional contact information and identified myself by name and credential, because I was not in the habit of doing things I needed to hide. I told him the examiner's office had confirmed receipt. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard in that kitchen. My father's hand, the one resting on the edge of the table, went very still. My mother's composed expression did not fall exactly, but it changed, the way a surface changes when you understand that what is underneath it is not what you assumed. I watched both of them arrive, at slightly different speeds, at the understanding of what I had actually done, which was not what they had asked me to do, but was the only version of help I was capable of offering without becoming someone I did not recognize. I pushed my chair back from the table. The legs made a sound against the floor, a flat, scraping sound, and it felt in that moment very final. My father said my name. He said it in a way he had not used in a long time, not with authority, not with the clipped efficiency of the breakfast table, but with something underneath it that might have been fear. I looked at him. I looked at him fully, the way I had not allowed myself to do for most of the week, because looking fully at someone means letting in everything you see, and I had been rationing that in order to stay functional. I told him I was not going to fix numbers that were inaccurate to protect a version of things that was not true. I told him I had spent 6 years building a professional reputation on the principle that accurate records matter regardless of who they inconvenience, and that I was not going to dismantle that for a tax situation that existed because someone had made choices over 3 years and hoped no one would count carefully enough to notice. I said it quietly. I said all of it quietly, because the quieter you speak in that house, the more clearly you are actually heard. My younger sister appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. She had her jacket on. She had a bag over one shoulder, the same worn canvas bag she had carried since sophomore year of college, and she was holding her car keys with both hands the way you hold something when you are ready to move. She had heard everything. I could see in her face that she had heard everything, and I could see something else too, a look I had not seen on her in years, the particular expression of someone who has been carrying something alone for so long that the moment someone else acknowledges the weight of it is almost unbearable. I picked up my invoice from the table. I picked up the original invoice, the one my father had placed on my plate on Tuesday morning, the one I had been carrying in the front pocket of my notebook since breakfast that day. I held them both for a moment, the two documents, his version and mine, and then I placed them both back on the table face up and walked away from them. I did not want them. I had made the point that needed to be made, and the point was not about money. The point was about what it means to be counted. We walked out through the front door together. The evening air was cool and still, the kind of stillness that feels deliberate after the inside of a house that has been holding its breath. The porch light was on. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had, the iron mailboxes, the pressure-washed driveways, the American flags hanging slack in the absence of wind. Everything on that street performing its own version of fine. I understood that performance better than I ever had. We sat in my car in the driveway for a moment before I started the engine. Neither of us spoke right away. The light in the front window of the house shifted as someone moved past it inside, a silhouette crossing behind the curtain and then gone. I looked at that window for a moment and then looked away. I opened my phone and navigated to my banking app. I had done the math the night before, quietly, the way I did everything, making sure the numbers confirmed what I intended before I committed to the action. The amount was there, already queued, already prepared. 2 semesters of tuition, the exact figure from the counter invoice, the exact amount that had been taken and redirected. I entered the university's payment portal information that my younger sister had texted me the previous afternoon, made sure every digit was correct, and pressed confirm. The transfer went through in under 30 seconds. A receipt appeared on the screen. I handed the phone across so she could see it. She looked at the screen for a long time without saying anything. Then she looked at me. Her eyes were wet, but her voice, when it finally came, was steady. She said she did not know how to thank me. I told her she had already done the hardest part. She had spent 2 months collecting the truth in a house that did not want it collected, and then she had trusted me with it, and that kind of trust was not nothing. That kind of trust was everything. I started the car. The headlights came on and lit the end of the driveway, the mailbox, the edge of the street beyond it. I did not look at the house again as I backed out. Some people talk about closure like it is a door you close firmly and then stand back and look at. I did not feel that. What I felt was simpler and more honest than closure. I felt the particular relief of a person who has finally stopped paying a debt that was never actually hers. The audit concluded 4 months later. The country club application was never submitted. The house was refinanced. Nobody called to apologize. And I learned, in the weeks that followed, what I should have understood years before, that leaving is not the hardest thing a daughter can do. The hardest thing is staying long enough, and being honest enough, and loving yourself enough to finally do the math.